Hello, this is Brian Auten from Apologetics315. Today's interview is with Dr. Holly Ordway. Her PhD is from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and she is a writer and a professor of English and literature. She's also author of Not God's Type, A Rational Academic Finds a Radical Faith, and her blog, Hieropraxis, can be found at hieropraxis.com. I'll be talking to her about her book and her journey from atheism to Christianity. Thanks for joining me today, Holly.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Well, I must say that I've really enjoyed reading your book, Not God's Type. It's such a fascinating read. I thought it was short, was powerful, a tremendous testimony to God's power to transform the heart and the mind. Your book was such an interesting read. So that our listeners know, this book is sort of a memoir of sorts of your journey from atheism to Christianity. Can you tell me a little bit more about your background, and weren't you just content to be an atheist?
I was, yes. I was a very reluctant convert. And I think sometimes when people who are non-believers find out about someone who's converted, I think they secretly wonder, oh, I bet she wanted to be a Christian all along. Well, no, actually, I didn't. I grew up pretty much in a non-religious household, not one that was hostile to faith, but one that religion simply was absent, except in kind of a cultural way. You know, we had a Christmas tree and whatnot. But I grew up just assuming that it wasn't important and never really gave it any thought about whether it was true or not. And so by default, I said, probably not true. It didn't matter anyway. And then when I got to college, I went to really good schools, but, secular schools, and the assumption was that religion was at best a historical curiosity or maybe a cultural flavoring. That was probably the most positive spin on it. Well, it's this thing in some places people have Christmas trees, and in other places they have something else, and that's what religion is. And so as I started asking questions about the way the world works and trying to understand it, I never thought of religion as being anything other than a kind of a generic, people have this thing called faith, it makes them feel better, well, yeah, whatever. And I never really thought about the fact that different religions have different truth claims, and that some of those truth claims might potentially be true. And as I became, more, as I grew into adulthood, especially in my late 20s, I found myself really being drawn more towards an aggressive atheism, where I concluded, and I think this is a reasonable conclusion, that if Christianity, particularly, that was the particular focus of it. If Christianity is not true, then it's kind of pernicious. It tells lies about the way the world is. It's kind of obnoxious, and so I didn't want any part of that, and I became very hostile to it. And that was really where I was when I had, I was 30 and thought that faith was something that intellectual people ought to reject because it was ridiculous. It was superstition, like having a rabbit's foot, on your keychain or something.
You mentioned there how, someone might be very skeptical of, say, if you will, a conversion story where someone used to be an atheist, they've become a Christian, and the idea there is, as you said, they were a Christian all along, or they weren't really a true atheist, because there's nothing that could bring someone who really understood the world to be a Christian, because they'd have to be deluded. Who fooled them? Who told them these lies or manipulated them emotionally? So have you run into that sort of skepticism when you've talked to people about your journey, them being very doubtful and curious of what reasons, what proof brought you to that point?
Well, I've seen some comments, some internet comments that basically said I'm a traitor to the atheist cause because if I bailed out on atheism, then I can't be very smart after all. Now, this is an interesting double bind, see, because if a Christian abandons his or her faith and becomes an atheist, then that's evidence that they're brilliant and clear thinking. But if an atheist abandons their atheism and goes to Christianity, then it's evidence that they must have really been secretly, an idiot all along. So that's one of those things that you just can't answer. And I mean, the only way that I really can respond to it is to say, well, look, I was an atheist In part because I had drifted into it. I hadn't really ever confronted the claims of Christianity in a way that was coherent and made sense. I didn't know what Christianity was actually about. Mm-hmm. And if in that context, actually, given what I thought Christians believe, I think atheism was actually a very rational position to hold. If, in fact, Christianity is, if you say the right thing about this guy in the sky, then you get a free ticket to heaven, and the people who don't know how to say the right words get punished. No, thank you. That's a rational position to hold. What I didn't realize is that's not Christianity.
Yeah.
And when I actually, became in a position mentally, psychologically, emotionally, to actually listen to what the claims were and think about them, then that was another story. But I think one of the things I really want to say to the skeptic is I did not want to become a Christian because it just appalled me. It didn't like Christians, broadly speaking. And I certainly didn't think, my life is going to be better if I become a Christian. And in fact, it didn't, not immediately. My life got harder when I became a Christian because now I had to deal with this thing called sin and the reality of God, and that was not easy. So it really wasn't about, wish fulfillment, because you can cut wish fulfillment both ways. You could say, people just want to be atheists because it allows them to do whatever they want. And sometimes people say that, and I think that's incorrect. There is an attraction to atheism, and I felt it. This idea that I get to call the shots myself, that I get to be the one who decides what's good. And if I want to be a good person, which I tried to be a good person, then it's me who gets to decide what the standards are. That's very appealing. But I think it's incorrect to say that that's the reason why most atheists are atheists.
Yeah.
I think the reason is that they think that it's reasonably true. And the same thing with Christianity. You can say that it's wish fulfillment because it, brings joy and peace, but, it's not wish fulfillment to think that my friends are probably going to give me presents on my birthday. I don't know that necessarily 100%. I have good reason to believe that they will. So it's not wish fulfillment to look forward to my birthday. It's the same thing with faith. It can cut either way.
Yeah. Well, we'll make sure to link to your wish list on the blog post. Now, in your book, you also mentioned that you used to have encounters with Christians trying to evangelize you, and you really were kind of turned off by it. And so tell me what it was about this sort of stereotypical evangelistic encounter that you would experience that was the turnoff, and why it just didn't work for you as an atheist at that time.
Well, I think as I've thought about this, and I think there are a couple elements that I didn't analyze at the time, but I think I can recognize as being part of my response. One part of the problem is that evangelists make a whole lot of assumptions. So, for example, if they say, you should come to Jesus, well, what does that statement even mean if you don't believe that God exists? If God doesn't exist, then Jesus is at best a Palestinian Jew who taught some nice things that we really can't live up to. Come to Jesus is about as meaningful as come to Winston Churchill. He's dead. It doesn't mean anything. So there's a huge disconnect right there. The same thing with the fire and brimstone. If you don't do X, Y, and Z, if you don't love Jesus, you'll go to hell. Well, there's a couple of big problems with that. Number one, you can't love someone on demand, not have feelings of love on demand. So this seems to set up an impossible bind or invite me into hypocrisy. I'll pretend I love him. Does that count? I'll say I love him. Okay. And then if you don't believe in God, then hell is kind of a moot point. I mean, when I was an atheist, I thought that when I died, I would just cease to exist. It's a little bit of a downer, but there you go. Mm-hmm. So the whole thing is predicated on assumptions. And so that's part of the problem. But the other part of the problem is that I think evangelists often try to sell Christianity. And this used to drive me nuts, and now I actually have sympathy for it. I still think it doesn't work, but I have sympathy because as a Christian, I really would like to share my faith because I believe it's true, and it really has transformed my life in an amazing way. I would like to share that with people I care about, and honestly, I would like to share that with anybody who also likes, would like to know the truth. So I understand the impulse. It's the same thing, like, for instance, I'm a fencer, so I'd like to tell people how great fencing is. I love the sport. I want to share it. That's an impulse that I think is very understandable. But unfortunately, there's so many other cultural things going on and psychological things going on that when your typical evangelist comes up and starts trying to convince you, wouldn't you like to go to heaven? Wouldn't you like to have joy and peace in your life? I mean, it sounds like he's pitching, for you to buy a condo in Florida. Mm-hmm. No, it just feels awful. And it's sort of a repugnance to it that made me not only not want to talk to that person, but made me not want to know anything about Christianity at all. And since the evangelists who do stuff like this are the most vocal, it made it very easy for me to just stereotype all Christians that way.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting as you're talking there. First, we mentioned your views as an atheist, and then how evangelists operate sometimes. So it seems to me that in both cases there's this knowledge gap where a certain person can hold atheism in a very strong way simply because, based upon misinformation or lack of information or this knowledge gap, they would probably be right to say there's no God or Christianity's false because they've got misinformation, they haven't heard the right thing. And then on the other hand, there's this knowledge gap on the evangelist's side where they're not understanding or taking into account the context of the understanding of the person they're talking to, and they're not adapting their message to the audience, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, what you really get is basically two ships passing in night and perhaps firing broadsides at each other.
Now, in the book, you go along in your journey, and one of the sparks that started to kindle something in your own thinking and in your heart was Christian poetry. Talk a little bit about how poetry sort of kind of cracked the door open for you.
Yeah. Now, this was at a point in my life. I was about 30 years old, and I'd finished my doctorate in English literature. I'd been working in the business world for a little bit, and I'd gotten back into teaching again, and I was prepping to teach a literature class. And so I had to reread, the things I was going to teach. And so I went back to, some Christian poetry that I was planning on teaching, and I was planning on teaching it because it was great poetry, part of the Western canon, and I considered myself to be big enough that I could teach people, I could teach poetry whose views I didn't agree with. I thought, okay, well, I don't believe in what these guys believe, but everybody recognizes that John Donne is a great poet. I'm going to put him in the class because this is beautiful language. It's very well constructed, and it's part of our tradition, our literary tradition. Well, that's all well and good. And then I started reading and rereading these poems on John Donne, Gerard Manley Hopkins, T.S. Eliot, George Herbert. And now, at this point, psychologically, I completely reject what these guys believe. And I think Christianity is a crock. And I don't want to be a Christian because I hate Christians. This is where I'm at this moment. So I'm reading it probably about as hostile as you can get to this set of beliefs. And sort of against my will, I'm finding as I read that there's a real connection there. And these poems just start to resonate with me, and in a deep way. And especially as I was reading John Donne's Holy Sonnet, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God, which opens with that line, for as yet you but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. And the poet's talking about, he's calling out to God and asking God to work in his heart, to free him from the bondage of sin, and to bring him into a living relationship. And he's acknowledging that this is going to be difficult and painful, and it's just difficult. And I'm reading this, and I really felt like there was some sort of current of energy just running through the poem. There's something going on in this poem that was deeply affecting to me, and I didn't know what it was. And I'm very self-analytical, so I started asking myself, what's going on? I don't believe what this guy believes. Why am I responding in this way, in a sort of visceral way that I never have before? And I thought, I don't believe what this guy believes, but maybe I've been writing off faith a little bit too quickly. I don't have it. I don't want it. But this guy, John Donne, he's brilliant. I can't dismiss him as being just some superstitious yokel, because he's writing some of the most beautiful intellectual poetry in the English language. Whatever he is, he's not stupid. So it kind of challenged me to think, what could it be that this poet holds that infuses his poetry that's such great art, and yet I don't understand it? And that unsettled me. And it was that desire just to understand better what is faith that led me to want to ask questions. And this is where the other piece comes into play, that at this point I actually had somebody whom I could ask. And that was my fencing coach, who I had gotten to know from working with him over the previous year, and had discovered that he was a Christian, and his wife was a Christian, and several of my other fencing comrades were Christians, but they didn't fit the stereotype.
Well, one of the things you write in your book that stood out for me, and I just had it underlined, was, if I might read a bit, it says, his name's Josh, and you say, Josh never reproached me for my unbelief, never tried to foist religious pamphlets on me or have an important conversation to tell me how to be saved, which is not to say he wasn't being a witness to Christ. On the contrary, all that year Josh had preached the gospel by living it, by being the best fencing coach I ever had, by caring about me not as a potential convert, but as me, a unique individual, and treating me always with respect. I thought, wow, what a powerful few sentences you've written there. There's so much in it that was so effective. Can you elaborate on how that relationship developed and how it influenced you more?
Well, I think, God really, without me being aware of it, I think that God was putting things into place where I would be able to hear the gospel. And one of them was my exposure to poetry, but the other is that, I've been a competitive fencer for many, many years. It's been a source of great joy and pleasure in my life. And so when I moved out to San Diego, I looked for a club to fence at, and I started fencing at this club and taking lessons from this coach, who I just saw right away is a great coach, great teacher, and, getting to know him. And you get to know someone's personality well, I think, when you work with them in a teacher-student relationship, especially if it's a one-on-one, like a fencing coach and student relationship is. I'm taking lessons with him once a week. I'm training with him, twice a week in the competitions. So after a year of training with him, I really had a pretty good insight into his character, which was that he rang true all the way through. At that point, probably the best human being that I had ever met. And I'm actually really blessed to have many more people like that in my life now. But at the time, he really stood out. There was something in him and in his wife that was just different. They were just really good people, and they cared about me. And that was evident in everything that they did and said. And yet they weren't trying to evangelize me. And I think Josh just read me correctly, that, I wasn't going to respond well to that. And so he respected that. But when I actually had then this desire to talk, that I had this desire to talk about faith, my first thought was, who the heck can I actually talk to? Because I'm embarrassed that I even want to talk about this. I don't think Christianity is true, so it's embarrassing to me that I think that I want to talk about faith. Mm-hmm. My self-esteem was at stake. And then I thought, well, you know what? I bet I can talk to Josh about this. I bet I can ask him questions, and he's not going to make me feel stupid. I was right. And I also thought, I bet I can ask him this, and it'll be safe. He won't get pushy on me. And I was right. We started this conversation, and I started asking him questions. And he answered my questions. He challenged me, because we'd known each other for a year, so he knew he could push a little bit and challenge me a little bit, because I knew that he respected me and I trusted him. So in that context, I was safe to be asking these questions. And I think it's important, too, that there was never any sense of expectation on his part. Because if I asked these questions and then let it go, he was still going to be my coach. he was still going to be that same person as he was. It wasn't like there's a time limit to his graciousness that if I don't become a Christian in, X number of months, then he's going to move on to the next person to evangelize. And that's one of the things that creeps me out about relationship evangelism, quote unquote, this idea that you go out and you make friends with atheists so that you can share the gospel. It's like, well, what if they don't hear it? Like, do you stop being their friend after a while? So we had a relationship as teacher-student that was not founded on any expectations of where I was going. And that freed me to feel that I could take this journey at my own pace, which actually turned out to get to be a pretty fast clip. But I felt safe, and that was so, so important.
You mentioned in the book him sharing different arguments with you, and you kind of went through the process of evaluating some of these arguments yourself. Talk about that. What was persuasive to you and what wasn't, and how you went about that?
Well, the first thing that was attractive to me in terms of the conversation was that there actually were arguments, because I'm a very analytically minded person. And when I started asking him, about his faith, I actually expected him to just say, well, I just believe it. The very fact that he said, well, I have reasons why I believe what I believe, that was huge. That was something I didn't know was the case. I didn't know that Christians had reasons. I thought they just believed. And I'm incapable of that. I cannot believe something just because I want to. I can't. It's just impossible. So I always thought that even if there was a God, if he just demands belief, I'm incapable of just giving belief on demand. Therefore, I'm automatically excluded from this relationship with him, even if he existed. But to find out that there could be reasons, that in itself really opened the door. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things that I think was important for me is that Josh never presented any one argument as being a knockdown, this is it, this proves that God exists, because there is no one argument like that. What we talked about really was worldview. How do we explain the world that we live in? What's the best explanation for it? Because atheism offers an explanation for the way the world is. Christianity offers an explanation. Other, religious views do as well. It's not the case that there's one killer argument for atheism or for Christianity. It's that you look at the overall worldview and you say, which one makes more sense in sum? And so what we did is we talked back and forth, kind of moving between different arguments, and I started to see the way that they were all pointing in the same direction, and they all cohered in a way that my atheistic views didn't. So, for example, some of the arguments that fell into place were some of the cosmological arguments for the existence of a first cause. And those arguments they make no statement about what this cause is like. They're purely philosophical. It says that there is something that is an uncaused cause. And then there was the moral argument that says, well, I experience in myself a sense of right and wrong. Where does that come from? And as you work through it, and this was the moral argument was probably one of the most significant, the most logical, the most satisfying, intellectually satisfying answer to why do I have a fundamental belief that there is such a thing as right and wrong is that it comes from a source. Now, I've been thinking this through, and sometimes I think people mistake the existence of counter-arguments with the disproving of arguments. And this is where I think my literary background maybe helps. English literature is kind of a crazy discipline. We, for example, I studied deconstructionism, which is basically a literary theory that says that texts have no meaning. That if you take certain set of literary kind of intellectual tools and you use them to attack a poem, eventually you will find that everything in the poem is self-contradictory and the meaning just dissolves. This is deconstructionism. Now, faced with that and working all the way through it, as a scholar in English literature, I came to the conclusion that just because you can make a statement doesn't mean that it's actually true. You can say, oh, look, this poem has no meaning because I can make it contradict itself if I work with it enough. But then as a reader, I have to step back and say, well, no, it actually does have meaning. And you can say that it doesn't, but experientially I know that it does, and that makes more sense, even though you can make an argument that it doesn't actually have meaning. And that's the same case with the argument for morality, because you can make a case, and I actually tried to make this case to Josh, that our sense of morality just comes kind of from pragmatism or from evolution, or it just helps us all survive better. But that explanation, if you step back and look at it, just doesn't make as much sense as the explanation that I really do genuinely have a moral sense, deeper than any pragmatic, consequences for myself. It's simply a brute fact. How do I explain that? And once I set aside my preconception that all claims about God had to be false, once I set aside that preconception, I could say, well, actually, it makes the most sense that I have this sense of morality because I'm getting it from somewhere.
Yeah, that's good. It's funny. It makes me think that, look, I can explain everything without God, therefore I don't need him. It's almost kind of like what Stephen Hawking has done. See, I figured out a way where I can explain it without God, but it's just a silly explanation when compared to God being an explanation as well.
And that was actually one of the most important insights that I had at the beginning of my journey, which was Josh had lent me a book called Does God Exist? A Debate Between J.P. Moreland and Kai Nielsen. And the introduction was by Peter Kraft. And I read this, and one of the first things that Kraft says in the introduction is that people will introduce psychological explanations for the existence of God. Like, we invented God because we needed a father figure to turn to. And I really bought into that. And I remember distinctly looking at that page thinking, ha, you try and crack that one, buddy. And then I turn the page, and he points out this truth that just blew my mind. He says the only time we search for a psychological explanation is when we have already concluded that the belief is false. Mm-hmm. And so he said we don't seek for a psychological explanation of why people believe 2 + 2 = 4. However, if someone believes 2 + 2 = 5, we know that to be false. Therefore, we can then look for another explanation of why they hold this belief. But if we look first for psychological explanations of God, we are actually assuming the very thing we are setting out to prove, which is we are assuming he does not exist. And that's just cheap. It's intellectually dishonest. And he just busted that for me.
Yeah. One thing I liked reading in your book is that the fact that you had an encounter with Christ. And so many times when I'm in a discussion with someone, I think, yes, I'm arguing that Christianity is true, but the core of it is that Christ is the truth. He's the end goal, and it's not truth as a proposition, but truth in the person of Jesus. So if he's real, and if he's there, and he's found by those who seek him, then why not try to seek him? So I see that you have this encounter with Christ, and you're thinking, I'm willing to believe it if it's true. For me, that's so essential, just to have a willingness up front to say, if the God of the Bible is there, and if he says to seek him, he'll be found, then why not go down that road, because you don't really have anything to lose? Or is there enough evidence to warrant a search? And if there is, then search. So what are your thoughts on that? And talk about this sort of experiment that you were doing and how you had this encounter.
Yeah, one thing I really, as an apologist myself, I keep coming back to the importance of the person of Jesus, because it's very easy when you study apologetics and theology to learn a lot of ideas about God, but then think that sharing ideas about God is the same thing as encountering God, and that's not the case. And I'm actually very fortunate that I've been very well discipled in my church, and the sacramental tradition for me has really drawn me into a deep personal experience and encounter with him. And that just has reinforced how important it is to recognize that he's a person, not a a set of propositions. And so for me, there really are two pieces to that. One is that right at the beginning, I recognized from Josh that this was more than just ideas. Because when we were having this conversation about the afterlife, and I said, we can't possibly know whether there's an afterlife or not because nobody comes back. And I thought I had really, sealed it. And Josh really turned the tables on me because he asked me what I thought at first was a, non sequitur. He says, Holly, do you trust me? And I said, yeah, I do. I do trust you. And he said, well, I know somebody who has told me that there's a world, that there's a life after this one, and I trust him. And he just left it at that. But that really had a big effect on me because the way that Josh spoke of this person, who I knew he was talking about Jesus, the way he spoke of him, he spoke of him as if he were somebody that he knew. And that kind of shook me because I was all ready to be in the realm of ideas, and we'd been talking about ideas. But it kind of showed me a glimpse that wasn't all that there was. But he didn't push it. And then we just talked about ideas, and we talked about ideas. And I got to the place where I actually intellectually accepted that God existed. And this was a big step because it kind of opened the door to considering what might God be like, and can I have a relationship with him? Because until I accepted that God existed as a logical, philosophical conclusion, I myself was not psychologically or emotionally able to seek him. I just can't seek somebody that I don't think there's any chance that they exist. Having gotten to that point intellectually, okay, God exists. There's a first cause. I think this first cause is the source of all that's good. What is this person like? Now, Christians claim that he interacts with us. What does that mean? How can you interact with an invisible being? And so I started trying to work out with Josh, what would it mean? What could I do to test whether or not this Christian idea of God is actually true? And we're talking back and forth about, well, maybe you could, invite him in, well, maybe in prayer. Well, no, I wasn't ready to do that. I felt that prayer was something that was beyond where I was right now. So how do you test it? Maybe if he's real, I might experience his presence. What does that mean? We're going back and forth talking about this over email conversation, and it was still kind of in process when I actually encountered Christ. And the actual experience was in some ways very non-dramatic because I was just coming home from work. I was going along the coast highway, beautiful view of the ocean, all that. And I'm kind of thinking over some of these arguments because they've been on my mind, obviously, a lot lately. And all of a sudden, I just had this recognition of the presence of an other, like capital O other, that there was somebody with me that was not just me. And I recognized this presence, and this is one of those things that if you haven't had this experience, if you're an unbeliever or a skeptic, you say, yeah, right, whatever. Well, I would have said that too, except, well, I recognize this presence as sure as if it had been another person actually physically there, and that was it, just the awareness of this presence. Didn't get any memo from God. That's it. But it was way more than I expected, and it was just about as much as I could cope with because it really was tremendously unsettling. And I dashed home and I emailed Josh as soon as I could because I knew I needed to put this into words because otherwise I would try to convince myself that it hadn't happened. But it had. And the thing is that I recognized that this was no longer just an intellectual activity. That Christ was a person who was drawing me into relationship with him, and that changed everything. It wasn't just, do I have a clearer mental understanding of, an abstract worldview? It was a person to whom I was going to respond or not. And it really brought a reality to the search. It really showed me I can't back off. I have to pursue this to the end because it matters.
Oh, that's phenomenal. So after having gone through this journey, we'll talk a little bit more about it here in a second, but I want to ask, if someone were to ask you today, well, why are you a Christian? What reasons would you give them?
Well, I would sum it up by saying I'm a Christian because I believe that the claims of the Christian faith are true. And there's no one answer to that. Mm-hmm. And at this point, when I first became a Christian, I had encountered Christ, so I knew he really was a person. And then I made my commitment to him that I did my research. I came to the conclusion that he really had become incarnate and died and been resurrected, and this was actually something that happened. And it because it happened, it demonstrated that he truly is God, and I had to do something about that. I had to respond, and so I did. But at that point, having accepted Christ as my Lord and Savior, I didn't have a relationship with him. And that's something that really has come in these last few years through discipleship, through prayer, and for me, fundamentally, through the Eucharist, through encountering him in the sacraments. And all of this now I can look at experientially and say, I have experienced his presence in a fundamental way that it's the same presence I encountered on Coast Highway, except I know who it is now. And so the experiential component is something that I could never have understood before I was a Christian, and it would not have convinced me as an argument. And by itself, I don't think the experience would have allowed me to come to him. I don't know, but I tend to think not, because of the kind of person that I am. I had to understand that this was actually true intellectually. But now that I'm a Christian, I see it's not just about the arguments, because somebody who, a child with Down syndrome who even if they grow up to an adult, that person will never be able to understand the arguments that convince me that Christianity is true. But that person can encounter Christ as I did experientially and know him. And so it's been an interesting thing for me because I am an intellectual. This is how I respond to the world. But always I come back to he's a person. He interacts with us personally if we want him to. There's that volitional component. He never forces himself on anyone. And that, to me, the encounter with him reinforces everything that I discovered to be true intellectually. And every passing year, as I seek him more fully, everything fits together more completely.
Sort of branching from that, then, I wanted to ask, if there was skeptics or atheists who would listen to this audio, and you had to speak right to them and encourage them, if you will, or I don't know what the word would be, but if you were to speak to them, what would you say to them, having been in their shoes, so to speak?
I would say that the pursuit of truth is the thing that unites us. That even before I was a Christian, Josh and I we shared a same fundamental value, which is that truth is the most important thing that anybody can seek. And Christians believe that this truth is found ultimately in a person. But we can agree that we want to seek truth. And I think that's what I would say to anybody is seek truth. Really ask the tough questions and be willing to think, what are my preconceptions? What am I bringing to the table? Do I want this to be true? Do I not? Do I want this not to be true? How do those desires affect my willingness to look at the evidence? because I think they do affect it both ways, both desiring it to be true and desiring it not to be true. Those things don't change the truth. The truth is what it is, no matter how we feel about it. But they can really color our willingness to go that further step. So I would say look for the truth one step at a time, and I have confidence that those who seek will find.
All right, now shifting gears then. You're an author and an apologist. What advice would you have to other fellow apologists in their communication, in their studies, in their approach to non-believers?
I would say, there's a couple of things I would say. The fundamental one, I think, is that our first witness is our character. Because, I know this from my own experience just so deeply, that Josh was a witness to me of the truth of the gospel before he even said word one about the existence of God. And I was willing to listen to him because of that witness. So the witness of our character runs so deep that who we are is so much more profound than what we say. And even the small word, even just the acknowledgement that we are Christians, is always couched in the context of our character. And so what we say is amplified by our character. And so that's why I think that discipleship is probably one of the biggest issues in the Christian church right now. We cannot share Christ if we don't know him. How can we point the way to the person if we don't know that person, really know him and not just know about him? So that would be my first point, that if we're going to lead people to him, we have to be walking the way of the cross and allowing him to shape us.
That's really helpful, Holly. Again, I really want to commend your book to others, and I think it can be of great benefit to us as Christian apologists. And so I want to thank you again for taking the time to speak with me today.
Oh, thank you.
I have been speaking with Holly Ordway, writer and a professor of English and literature, and author of Not God's Type, A Rational Academic Finds a Radical Faith. Check out today's blog post at Apologetics315 for links to her book and her blog and other helpful links to Holly's resources. This is Brian Oughton of Apologetics315, and thanks for listening.